The fire was small that night, the way fires were kept small in winter when wood had to be carried far and the cold pressed close against the canvas of the tent. John Stands in Timber was still a boy then, maybe 10, maybe 12. The years blurred the way they do for children who measure time by seasons instead of numbers. And he sat where boys were supposed to sit, at the edge of the circle, close enough to hear, but not so close that the old men would think he was pretending to be one of them. His grandmother had told him to be quiet. He was good at being quiet. It was the only way anyone ever let him stay. The old men who gathered in his family's lodge on the Tongue River Reservation in those years were not many, and every winter there seemed to be fewer. They had been young warriors once, young enough to ride, young enough to matter, and now their hands shook when they held their pipes, and their eyes had gone the color of old ice. But when they spoke of the summer the soldiers came to the valley of the greasy grass, something changed in them. Their voices dropped, then rose. Their hands began to move, cutting shapes in the firelit air, a ridgeline, a river bend, the sweep of a horse running low and hard. Stands in Timber's own grandfather, a respected man named Lame White Man, had been among the dead that day. He had not lived to grow old and tell his own version by the fire. So the boy listened instead to the others, the ones who had survived, to Wooden Leg, to Two Moon, to the women who had run with their children toward the timber when the first shots cracked over the village at dawn. Each one carried a piece of it. No two pieces were quite the same, and that troubled him even then, though he did not yet have the words for why. He would only understand it later, at the government school in Lawrence, Kansas, Haskell Institute, where Indian children were sent to be unmade and remade into something the government found more convenient. There, in a library that smelled of paper and radiator heat, he first read a white man's account of the battle at the Little Bighorn. It was full of confidence. It named which regiment moved where, at what hour, under whose command, as if the writer had stood invisible on the hill and watched the whole thing unfold like a parade. It did not match anything he had heard by the fire. That was the moment, though he could not have said so cleanly at the time, that his life's work found him. Someone was going to have to write down what the old people said before there was no one left who remembered saying it. He decided, quietly, without ceremony, that it would be him. It took him decades. He was not in a hurry, because grief is not in a hurry, and neither is truth. He went back to the reservation after Haskell and began doing something almost no one had thought to do systematically. He asked. He sat with old men who had fought that day and were now blind, or nearly so, and he wrote down their words exactly as they gave them, resisting the urge to smooth the rough edges or make the story make more sense than it actually had made while it was happening. He talked to Wooden Leg, who remembered the sun and the dust and the strange high sound the soldiers' horses made when they were frightened. He talked to women who had been girls that day, who remembered running with babies on their backs while bullets went overhead like hornets, not knowing whether they were running toward safety or into it. He talked to men who would personally seen Custer's soldiers die and would not say so boastfully, because to the Cheyenne there was no boast in it, only the plain, heavy fact of a day when the world tried to end their people and did not succeed, though it came terribly close. Piece by piece, the story he had heard as a boy stopped being a scattering of firelit fragments and became something whole. Not a single tidy narrative, because the truth of that day would never be tidy, but a woven thing, the way a shirt is woven from many threads that do not individually look like a shirt. He would spend the rest of his life making sure that weave did not come apart. What follows is that story, gathered from the voices he preserved, not as any single survivor told it, but as the pattern that emerged from all of them together, the way John Stands in Timber himself believed it had to be told, from inside the village, looking out. The village on the greasy grass, the river white maps would later call the Little Bighorn, was enormous that June, larger than almost anyone then living had seen. 6 great circles of lodges strung along the west bank for nearly 3 miles, Hunkpapa, Oglala, Miniconju, Sandsark, Blackfeet, Two Kettle, and at the northern end, apart but not far, the Cheyenne. It was hot already by mid-morning, the kind of dry plains heat that makes the air over the grass go wavy and thin. Horses grazed by the thousands on the benchlands to the west. Children swam in the river. Women worked hides stretched on frames, their laughter carrying between the lodges. There had been a Sundance not long before, and there was still something of that ceremony's held breath in the camp. The sense, some would say afterward, that they had been gathered together on purpose at the right time for what was coming. No one expected soldiers that day. Scouts had seen dust, had seen movement, but movement was not unusual with so many people and horses spread across the valley. Nobody imagined that Longhair, the name the Cheyenne and Lakota used for Custer, for his flowing hair, though he had in fact cut it short for this campaign, would attack a village of this size in broad daylight with the force he had. The first sign, for most people in camp, was not a bugle or a shout. It was the horses. Loose horses stampeding through the southern end of the village, and behind them a rising drum of hooves that did not belong to any of their own. Then the shooting started. Major Marcus Reno's battalion came first, charging down from the bluffs on the southern end of the valley and across the flat toward the Hunkpapa circle. For a handful of minutes it looked from inside the camp as though the soldiers might ride straight through the village entire, an unthinkable thing, women and children scattered directly in their path. What saved the camp in those first chaotic minutes was speed of a different kind, the speed with which Lakota and Cheyenne fighting men reached their horses. There was no formation to it, no bugle call organizing the response. A man heard the shooting, grabbed whatever weapon was nearest, a rifle if he had one, a bow if he did not, a stone club if that was what was in his hand, and rode toward the sound, sometimes still pulling on leggings as he went. Discipline, in the way soldiers understood the word, did not apply. What applied instead was that nearly every able man in that valley moved toward danger at almost the same moment, and there were far more of them in the end than Reno's officers had been told to expect. Reno's men reached a line of timber along the river and, for a short while, tried to hold there. But warriors were working around the flanks and into the trees themselves, and word passed through the soldiers, correctly or not, that they were about to be surrounded entirely. The retreat that followed was not orderly. Men and horses went back across the river and up the bluffs on the far side in a scramble that cost more lives than the fighting itself had. Soldiers falling from their saddles into the water, warriors riding alongside close enough to strike them down with clubs and coup sticks as much as with bullets. From the Cheyenne circle at the northern end, this first fighting was heard more than seen, gunfire rolling down the valley, then a strange lull. What no one in the village yet understood was that this had only been one arm of the attack. Longhair himself, with a larger body of men, had been moving the entire time along the bluffs to the east, out of sight, working his way toward the northern end of the camp. By the time the second alarm went up, the shape of the danger had become clearer, and the response had hardened into something more purposeful. Lame White Man, Stan's Timber's own grandfather, had been in his lodge when the first shooting broke out to the south. Accounts agree that in the confusion he did not immediately have his weapons or his best horse to hand. Some remembered him going out at first without full preparation, wrapped only in a piece of cloth, driven more by the urgency of the moment than by readiness. He was a respected man among the Cheyenne, not a chief by title in every sense the word carried, but a man other men would follow when he moved with purpose, and that day he moved with purpose. As word came that soldiers were now approaching from the east, above the village, along the ridges, a second force, distinct from the one Reno had led into the timber, the fighting men of the northern circles began to gather and cross the river, climbing up out of the willows and cottonwoods toward the high ground, meeting the new threat before it could fully close on the lodges below. This was the beginning of what would become on the maps drawn much later by men who were never there, Custer's last stand. But it did not begin as a single dramatic moment on a single hill. It began as it had in the South, as a swelling response, man by man, rider by rider, moving to meet an enemy that was, in truth, already in serious trouble the moment it was seen. Custer's men, some 200 and some odd soldiers in 5 companies, had come down toward a coulee that led to the river, apparently hoping to cross and strike into the village itself, perhaps to take women and children as leverage, as had worked in earlier campaigns against other villages. If that was the plan, the terrain and the sheer number of warriors now converging denied it to him almost immediately. Warriors under Gall, a Hunkpapa leader whose own family had been killed in the fighting to the south, blocked the crossing at the ford with fierce and immediate resistance. The soldiers there were turned back before they ever reached the water in force. From that point, Custer's companies began to be pushed north and east, up onto the ridge that would carry his name into history, and the space in which they could maneuver began, steadily and without any single dramatic turn, to shrink. What happened on Custer Ridge in the hour or so that followed was, by every honest account gathered afterward, white and Cheyenne and Lakota alike, chaos given shape only in hindsight. No participant on either side saw the whole of it. Each warrior who took part remembered his own stretch of ground, his own charge, his own moment of danger, and it was only by weaving these fragments together patiently over years that anything like a full picture could be assembled, which was precisely the work Stands in Timber gave his life to. The soldiers' companies were broken apart from one another early, cut off in the folds of the land, unable to reinforce each other. Warriors moved through the gaps on foot as well as on horseback, using the contours of the coulees for cover, working close enough in places to fight hand to hand. Crazy Horse, the Oglala war leader whose name would become inseparable from the battle in later telling, led a body of warriors in a sweeping charge from the north that helped collapse what order the soldiers had left. Other Lakota and Cheyenne fighters pressed from the south and west. The soldiers, in the accounts of those who fought them, seemed by the final stage to understand that there was no more maneuvering to be done, only enduring. And then, for most of them, not even that. It was in this fighting, on the slope below what came to be called Last Stand Hill, that Lame White Man was killed. The accounts Stands in Timber gathered from those who were near him agree on the essential fact, if not on every detail, that he was struck down by gunfire from soldiers still fighting in a knot on the ridge, in the same stretch of ground where the last of Custer's men were themselves being overwhelmed. There is a particular terrible irony preserved in the oral tradition, that in the swirl of dust and smoke and closely mixed combatants, some Cheyenne fighters may not immediately have recognized his body as one of their own, mistaking him in the chaos for an enemy scout, until someone close enough called out, and the truth of it settled over them. His death was not staged, was not a single clean moment a painter could later capture with the light falling just so. It was one particular grief inside a much larger one, absorbed into the noise and pressed forward past almost before it could be mourned, because the fighting was not yet finished. The soldiers on the ridge, what remained of them, drew into a tightening knot as their number thinned. Horses, many already dead or shot to make breastworks of their bodies, gave the ground a terrible, particular look that survivors described decades later still with a kind of hush, not triumph in the telling, but a plain, weighted remembering. The end, when it came in minutes, rather than the long, heroic hours later legend would grant it. By the time the guns fell quiet on that hill, every soldier who had ridden up onto it with Custer was dead. The quiet that followed was its own kind of violence. Down in the village, women who had spent the day in the ravines with their children, listening to gunfire roll back and forth across the hills without being able to see any of it, began at last to hear it fade. Older boys were sent up to learn what had happened. Word came back in pieces, the way word always did. Soldiers to the south had been driven onto the bluffs and were still up there, still dangerous, still to be watched. And to the north, on the long ridge above the river, there were no soldiers left standing at all. That night, the camp did not celebrate in the way outsiders would later imagine, picturing wild jubilation. There was relief, yes, the terrible fear of the morning, that the village itself might be overrun, its women and children taken or killed, had not come to pass. But there was also grief, close and immediate, families counting their own dead and wounded, women wailing in the way Cheyenne and Lakota women wailed for the fallen, a sound that did not distinguish between the honor of a warrior's death and the plain fact of losing him. Lame White Man's family grieved as any family grieves. His grandson would not be born for years yet, would carry that grief second-hand, inherited rather than lived, and it was exactly that second-hand grief, Stands in Timber would say much later, that made him unwilling to let the story be told only by people who had never stood in that valley at all. The following day, scouts confirmed that the soldiers who had escaped the fighting near the village, the survivors of Reno's command, joined now by another officer, Benteen, and his men, remained dug in on the bluffs to the south, and that more soldiers might be coming. The great village, having accomplished what it needed to survive the day, began to break apart into smaller groups and move, as villages of that size always eventually had to, following the game and the grass, scattering across the plains in directions the army's remaining forces could not easily follow. They did not know yet, most of them, what the battle would come to mean. that a single defeat of an army detachment on a June afternoon would be transformed within days in newspapers thousands of miles east into a national wound demanding vengeance, that the victory at the greasy grass would be followed within a year by a scattering of the very peoples who had won it, driven onto reservations, their freedom to hunt and move across the plains largely ended. Victory that day did not purchase safety. It only delayed and in some ways hardened what came after. For decades afterward, the story that reached most of the country came almost entirely from the other side of the hill, from officers' reports, from newspaper correspondents who had never set foot in Montana, from later historians working from military records and the recollections of the handful of soldiers who had survived because they had been with Reno and Benteen rather than with Custer. That version had its own internal logic, numbered its companies, plotted its movements on maps with the tidy confidence of men accustomed to believing that events unfold according to someone's plan. What that version rarely captured, because it had no way to capture it, was the experience from inside the village. The fact that for the Cheyenne and Lakota who fought that day, there had been no grand strategy, no named formations advancing in choreographed stages. There had been alarm and then response. Man following man toward danger because the alternative was to let danger reach the women and children behind them. There had been confusion as thick on their side as on the soldiers. There had been ordinary men, farmers and hunters as much as warriors, doing an extraordinary and terrible thing because the moment required it of them. And there had been real, unglamorous grief afterward for the ones who did not come home from doing it. This was the corrective Stanton Timber spent his life assembling, not to glorify the killing of Custer's men. He was careful in every account he gathered and preserved never to let the story tip into triumphalism, but to insist that the people who had lived through that day and buried their own dead because of it had a version of events every bit as true and considerably more intimate than the one written by men who arrived only after the shooting had stopped. By the time John Stanton Timber was old himself, his hair gone the same white ice color he remembered in the men who had first told him these stories by the fire, he had spent the better part of 60 years doing the quiet, patient work of listening. He had eventually worked with a researcher, Margot Liberty, to see the material gathered into a book so that it would not simply die with him the way it had so nearly died with the last of the old warriors he had interviewed as a young man. He was asked, more than once in those later years, why it had mattered so much to him, why an old man would spend a lifetime chasing down fragments of a single terrible day in June, sitting for hours with people whose memories were fading, whose English was imperfect, whose stories sometimes contradicted one another in ways that never quite resolved. His answer, in substance if not always in the exact words recorded, came back always to the same thing, that his grandfather had died in that valley, and that the version of his grandfather's death and of everyone else's on every side of that hill that traveled furthest and settled deepest into the world's memory had for too long been the version told by people who were never there to see it. Someone had to make sure the ones who had been there were not written out of their own history. Someone had to sit at the edge of the fire, the way he had as a boy, and actually listen. He did not claim in the end to have captured the whole and perfect truth of that June day. No one honestly could, not the generals with their after-action reports, not the correspondents with their telegraph dispatches, not even the warriors themselves, each of whom had only ever seen his own narrow slice of an afternoon that dissolved for everyone in it into dust and noise and the plain animal urgency of survival. What he believed he had done and what he hoped would outlast him was simpler than a claim to total truth. He had made sure that when the story of that hill above the Little Bighorn was told, it would no longer be told by only one side of the river. The fire by which he had once sat as a quiet boy had long since gone out, but the voices that had spoken across it, Wooden Legs, Two Moons, the women who remembered running with children through the willows, and somewhere among them, second-hand but no less real, his own grandfathers, did not go out with it. They had been carried forward, thread by thread, into something that would hold. That, in the end, was the only kind of last stand John Stanton Timber ever wanted to be part of. Not a hill, not a defeat, but a story held.